Hi, this is Joe Loria. Before you watch our latest episode of CN Live, I just wanted to thank you, the viewers and readers of Consortium News, for your past generosity in funding our unique website. It was begun 25 years ago, in November 1995, by Bob Perry, one of the best investigative reporters in American journalistic history. Bob depended on readers as well for the independence that Consortium News has always had. And during these days of crisis and pandemic and the crisis in journalism with Julian Assange languishing in prison, we ask you to support us through these tough times so that we can continue to bring you these special stories, a unique perspective on news that you won't find in corporate media. Thank you.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live, Episode 11, Season 2, America in Revolt. I'm Joe Loria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss.
There has been a time, it seems, that many have anticipated, but whose timing could never precisely be predicted. After 40 years of economic policies designed to create massive income inequality, and after 400 years of oppression of African Americans, and in the midst of an historic pandemic, the social explosion has occurred. A protest begun by yet another police killing of an unarmed black man filmed with mobile phones spread in days beyond the United States. One act of police brutality has led to hundreds of horrific incidents of police violence, dramatically exposing what the true nature of the American police appears to be. Forget the shield for a moment, and what one sees are heavily armed, black-clad agents of state violence to protect powerful interests from a population being defrauded and deceived that are suddenly no longer accepting it. The very essence of a 30-year program to militarize local police seemed geared towards just this moment, when an abused nation would not take it anymore. There are numerous questions that we will explore on tonight's program. One is the role of violence in social protest. Martin Luther King's quote about a riot being the language of the unheard has aptly been making the rounds. The blaming of outside agitators emerged again from the depths of the 1960s Deep South, or from a Middle East dictatorship when trying to deflect responsibility for pushing a society to the brink. Authoritarians are fond of saying of their enemies that, quote, violence is the only language that they understand. But can that be turned around to say that that is the only language understood by oppressive leaders? Ultimately, the question is, can this moment produce serious reform in policing and economic policy to address decades of legitimate grievance? Can this moment produce serious reform of policing and economic policy in the long run? With us tonight to discuss these and other questions are Richard Wolff, Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Massachusetts and a commentator on political and economic issues, Garland Nixon, a former Baltimore police officer and now a radio host of the show Fault Lines, Margaret Kimberly, journalist, author, and columnist at the Black Agenda Report, and Brian Becker, a longtime coordinator for the Answer Coalition and a co-host of the radio program Loud and Clear. Richard, thank you for joining us. Let me begin with you. I laid out a lot of themes there. I was wondering if you could set the historical context for this social revolt that we are seeing.
Okay, let me focus on what I know best, and I'm sure others will have other dimensions that they know better and that they can help us with. You're quite right. This has been building for a very long time. To put it in the broadest historical perspective, one of the most remarkable things about the United States was that from around 1820 to roughly the 1970s, every decade shows a rising level of real wages. That is, the average real wage, what you could afford to buy with whatever money wage you got, went up. Even across the Great Depression, it went up because the wages dropping in dollars were more than matched by the prices of what they had to buy dropping even further. So you've developed in the United States over those 150 years a peculiar mentality peculiar in the sense that no other capitalist country was able to assemble that kind of record. So Americans began to think that they were exceptional, that God liked them better than everybody else because he was giving them such a wonderful run, that capitalism was a very nice system because their real wages were rising, and finally, that it was somehow built into the United States that every generation would live better than the one before. And if you worked hard and went to school, well, by golly, you will live better than your parents. All of that ended in the 1970s, which is why your use of numbers like 40 or 50 years is actually quite historically appropriate. The last 40 or 50 years have been the time when real wages stopped rising. Now, this was not discussed in the United States. The vast majority of people had no idea, and I'm including here politicians, journalists, and academicians. The numbers were there, but they didn't get the attention. And so all that happened was that the mass of the American working class began to notice the obvious, which is their wages weren't going up. Their standard of living wasn't going up. And in the good tradition of individualism, they mostly blamed themselves, as if it was an individual problem and not the economy or the society. And so the working class did two things in America. Number one, if you can't get more dollars per hour in real wage, well, then do more hours. And everybody with one job got a second job. And if the members of the household hadn't been working for pay, they were now pressed to do so, creating, for the first time in American history, that spectacular movement of adult white women out of the house and into the paid labor force, because there was no other way for the so-called American dream to be realized, given that real wages were going nowhere. Just a footnote, they have gone nowhere in the last 50 years. Real wages today are not much different from what they were in the late 1970s. The extra work didn't solve the problem. Pushing women out into the labor force didn't solve the problem. So the American working class did the second private individual action to try to cope. They became the working class willing and able to go into debt on a scale that no working class in any other country had ever done before. We didn't even have credit cards for the mass of people before the 1970s. That's when they were invented. Before that, they were something that businessmen and women used, the American Express card and so on. But the MasterCard and Visa, that's a new industry designed to provide massive credit. So when you come to the end of the century, you have a working class staggering under amount of work that is exhausting physically and mentally, and anxiety ridden because by the turn of the century, they had accumulated a quantity of debt they knew they could never repay. And in 2008, the system crashed. It crashed because on a stale, stable, stagnant real wage, you cannot keep accumulating more and more debt. It doesn't take rocket science to understand eventually, and in 2008, we know you can't cover your mortgage, you can't make your credit card payments, et cetera, et cetera. Even had to develop for the first time in America that the generation of this last 25 years is a generation of students who cannot get a bachelor's degree without going into tens of thousands of dollars of debt. So we have an additional debt category beyond mortgage, auto debt, and credit cards. We now have student debt. That also is unpayable, and that has put an extra burden on young people, especially because the decline in the quality and quantity of jobs and incomes make the debt that they incurred to get a BA less supportable than ever. Under these circumstances, you have a working class that I would define as tinder, very dry tinder, waiting for a spark, whatever that spark might be, to begin to articulate its bitterness, its rage, its disappointment at being denied the American dream that they had been led to expect would be theirs. And that's what I think has happened now. I think that the racial dimension is the spark, is the trigger, is the event that is bringing it all kind of forward. Let me conclude this historical context with a little bit of history, not of the past, but of what is coming, because I believe that is absolutely crucial to understanding where we are. This crash, the one that happened on top of the pandemic, this crash of capitalism in our country and abroad, is a kind of declaration of war against the American working class. Whatever happened before, it is now about to get much worse. When you have 42 million people unemployed, you are inviting every employer to say to these unemployed people, if and when you come back, I'm going to pay you 20% less. I'm going to give you fewer benefits. I'm going to make you come into work longer. You are going to have to take whatever I dish out. At the same time, the same message will be given to the workers still working. And they too will be assaulted now. So we're in for an extraordinary moment. It has to be put in these terms. The employer class, the capitalist class, having really messed up on the pandemic and on the cycle, is now in a position to be able, ironically, to go much further in the assault on the working class than they were able to achieve in the last 40 years. And that's the next step. And that means protests far beyond what we have seen already.
Thank you, Richard. We're going to turn to Brian Becker now. We know Brian has to leave us. Brian Becker is joining us. He's the longtime coordinator for the Answer Coalition and a co-host of the radio program Loud and Clear. Brian, thanks for coming on. You've been in this business a long time in protests. Set the historical context, please, of what we're actually witnessing now.
I think in many ways this is unprecedented, what we're witnessing. Of course, there were the urban rebellions of the 1960s, starting in 1964 with Rochester, New York, where I was a child at the time. Harlem came shortly thereafter. There was Watts in 1965, Newark in 1967, Detroit in 1967. Of course, after Dr. King was killed, 120 cities basically went up in flames. The whole 56 years since the beginning of urban rebellions in the United States, the triggering event has almost always been a police killing or a vigilante killing, almost always. And for 56 years, the same time period, every time there is a rebellion against a police killing, a rebellion against racism, a rebellion or a fight back against the ruling class war against Black America, which has never ended. It started in 1619 and has never ended. Each and every time, the rebellion is defined as the work of outside agitators, without hesitation and with complete consistency. And in this case, we have the remarkable event that we have rebellions going on in 50 cities, and every mayor in 50 states, hundreds of cities, and every mayor says it's outside agitators. So obviously, the people who are living in New York went to some other place to carry out a rebellion, and the people in that city went to some other place. The ludicrous character of it is so obvious. At wartime, people are told, we're all Americans. Let's unite as a country. But when it comes to fighting against the war waged by police against Black America and Latino America, against poor America, when it's time to fight that war, you have to stay in your own zip code, apparently, otherwise you're an outside agitator. The real situation here, and the thing that we have to observe, is that this now 10-day-old rebellion has gone through many different stages and phases. I have been pretty much in the street for the past week, and so I've been able to observe and participate with large numbers of other people. In the first days, as the police tear gassed us, as they used pepper spray, as they hit people with batons, people ran. The second day, they ran. There would be almost stampeding. We'd be running down the street. People would be panicked. By the end of the second night, people stopped running. Other people started saying, slow down, don't run. And the people came back and they became more confident. They started to solve problems. They started to take care of the wounded. They identified agents provocateurs. They became like an organic community of resistance. And this steadfast development of these many, many organic communities of resistance on the ground, anchored in Black working class youth, but with many, many other people there. I mean, it's a remarkably multinational or multiracial, whatever formula you want to use, but anchored really in the Black community and among Black youth. This community of resistance, this organization of resistance, has been able to go up and stay up. On Sunday, the reason I want to go through this a little bit is to come to what I believe the ruling class in America really fears, what they really fear, and they are really scared right now. And in fact, that explains the fracturing going on around Donald Trump, where even James Mad Dog Mattis says Trump is a sinister force, partly to save his own reputation, but partly as an indicator of the ruling class's trepidations about what's to come. On Sunday in Washington, the police department, and this was with Muriel Bowser, a Democratic mayor in DC, went along with this. They allowed a small handful of people. I was in the neighborhoods, the small number of people who were breaking windows, doing some looting, and they let it play. They let it play and play and play. There were hundreds of cops all over the place. They didn't set up a police line. They let it play on Sunday night. And then on Monday morning, they had all the footage they needed to declare curfews around the country. And also that allowed Donald Trump to go and say, look, we're going to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807, and we're going to use the federal U.S. military to invade parts of the United States. In those states where the governors had been delinquent in using violent enough tactics to suppress their own demonstrations, we're going to invade the United States. And the moment he was doing that, that was that photo op right around the time of the photo op in front of St. John's Historic Church here in Washington, where in order to take the picture, Barr and Trump ordered the Secret Service and National Guard to carry out this violent assault against the media and peaceful protesters. Trump came out to show he's the tough guy. He wasn't the bunker boy, he was the tough guy. And when he did that, and on top of all of these curfews, the response of the masses of people was very decisive. By Tuesday night, 2 nights ago, instead of being cowed and intimidated, the numbers grew to the largest point yet. In Washington, it was 10,000 people in the streets, and they defied the curfew. And the same was true all over the country. And so what I think is happening, and this is why I think it's somewhat unprecedented, is that this is an enduring rebellion, and the federal government has been cast onto the defensive. Trump is in trouble right now. Trump is reeling right now. And elements of the ruling class who weren't that keen on Trump anyway, who feel he's a bad manager, he's not doing what Karl Marx and Frederick Engels said in the Communist Manifesto was the chief job of the executive, which was to manage the common affairs of the bourgeoisie. Trump was pretty much just focused on his own affairs. They'd like to get rid of him. And so the tide has turned right now against Trump. And at this moment, you see the same Democratic Party that was designating the demonstrators as looters and outside agitators 5 days ago is now sensing opportunity and coming back into the fold a little bit. And you'll see it in Washington. There's going to be a massive, it could be 100,000 or more on Saturday demonstration. And a lot of the same Democratic Party politicians who were denouncing our movement and the movement days ago will try to take the leadership of it. So they failed to defeat the movement in its stage of insurrection. The people stayed strong. So now they will try various methods of co-optation for parts of the movement. And that's what's going to come next. But this is going to be a tug of war because, of course, Trump is still mobilizing and would like to use the iron fist on the demonstrators. I think we are witnessing what is like a preview, a dress rehearsal in embryonic form of what revolutions actually look like. They're messy, they're not straight, one line, they have ebbs and flows. There's a core anchoring social force that is the real driver, the motor of the revolution. And at the same time, there are different organizations and entities and classes that are trying to put their stamp, their imprint on what this revolution or embryonic revolution or dress rehearsal revolution will actually look like and what its final goals should be. Bottom line is that we have a different kind of problem in the United States than exists, say, in Europe. In Europe, the government would have fallen by now. Trump would no longer be prime minister or the head of state. There would be new ministers. They would come out and say, we hear you, we were wrong, we need a change of course, we're going to make some significant concessions. Maybe like in 1968, when the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was passed just 6 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated and America's cities were burning. The government did something. But right now, this government, Republican and Democrats, are offering the masses of rebellious people absolutely nothing. Trump's not going to resign. There's not going to be a falling of the government. The Democrats are offering nothing. Joe Biden retains his position as the absolute mummy in the basement, whose basic pitch is that I'm not Donald Trump, hoping that that will be enough to get them the election, but not offering the masses anything. So we have an opportunity, but we have a fundamental problem for the left. The left has, because of the way the American electoral system is organized, there's no parliament. You know, Bernie Sanders or earlier Jesse Jackson would have had 20% of the vote. They would have had their own political forces. They would have had some influence in the government. All progressive forces are completely locked out of the government. The Democratic Party is clearly not a vessel for change. When Bernie Sanders looked like he might win, they crushed him. And third parties are not viable because each of the 50 states has organized the election system in a way that makes it impossible for third parties in America to win. So there's this, unlike the rest of the world, the left has no organized voice short of insurrectionary politics, short of revolutionary politics. And that's really, I think, for the left, the big question. We have to, one, engage as we have been with the masses of people who are fighting, go through the same experiences with them, fight the same battles. We have to do that. We are trying to do that. In our case, in my organization, we have people in more than 100 cities who have been out in the streets nonstop for the last 10 days. But more than that, we have to be able to let the left's imprint start to show itself on the demonstrations with demands that link police brutality and the nonstop war against Black America with the system of capitalism. And we have to help integrate or merge with all of these new organizations that are forming. They're forming all over the country on the grassroots level among young people who are looking and forming their own organizations, but they don't have names. They don't have a political program. It's wide open, but it's this vast new canvas for revolutionary politics. So I think we're at a moment we're at a fork in the road, but it's the kind of fork we want to be at. COVID-19, as Richard mentioned, the 50 million unemployed, which was a policy choice. It wasn't because of the pandemic. The crisis of having Trump as president, and the crisis of a now new rebellion by large numbers of people anchored in the Black community, which has always been the motor force for progressive change in America. This represents a very new day, a new opportunity for the left to try to become strong once again. And that's actually should be, for all of us, it would seem to me, our top agenda point.
Brian, one question, please, before you go. One key point in every revolt seems to be when the state forces of violence, the police and the military, refuse to fire on the population, and in some cases even turn against the state and join the uprising. Do you see any possibility of that? Are there any signs of that happening already?
Well, you know, there are a few instances where the police have taken a knee, but that's just designed to sort of slow things down. That's not real solidarity. The police are the police. In revolutionary moments, rank and file soldiers who are from the working class can be won over. When ordered to shoot their fellow workers, they say no, and they turn the guns around, so to speak. I mean, that was the slogan of the left in World War I. And, you know, a lot of workers did that. Same happened in Vietnam when conscripted soldiers fragged their officers rather than go into battle. That's how many battles ended. They just killed their officer and went back to base. But the problem we have now, the police are the substitute for like a fascist terror organization in the United States. And the police cannot be won over, from my point of view. Yes, the police come from working class backgrounds, perhaps. The police have unions, but these unions are more or less semi-fascistic unions. The police, their job is to suppress the working class and to suppress oppressed communities. So I don't see any hope at all within the police. Inside the military, inside the Army, our organization, inside the Answer Coalition, we've done lots of GI organizing ever since 2002. And we've had active duty mobilizing in bases and even in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And we've recruited quite a number of soldiers and sailors and Marines. But that's all slowed down as the intensity of the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan slowed down. So, and it's a volunteer, not conscripted army. So those are different, sort of way different than it was during Vietnam.
You mentioned Afghanistan and Iraq, and many police now are veterans of those wars, and they seem to treat the population as the enemy with a military mentality rather than policing.
Let me just say one last thing. I don't know if you all saw in Washington, the government brought in Black Hawk helicopters in these show of force maneuvers. So they came right down on us, like 50 feet over your head. And the wind and the dust was so great, you couldn't move. You were paralyzed. And these show of force maneuvers were perfected in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and in Iraq. So the point you're making, how it's not just the individual cops, but the tactics of warfare against oppressed people overseas have clearly migrated back to American police departments. I mean,
Brian,
this is amazing.
Yeah, now, Brian, you said that police were allowing looting to go on. And there have also been a lot of videos emerging where cops have been breaking windows of a jewelry shop, of their own cars. So what you're saying is they seem to be setting up excuses to be able to go in and crack heads then, to make it seem worse than it is.
They did that. But what I'm saying also is that was the big move on Sunday. We saw it exactly. We were analyzing it. We were out in the street. We could see it happening. But that was all the pretext for the curfew and also for Trump's invocation of the Insurrection Act of 1807. But it's failed. It failed. The most important point that I want to make, that tactic by the DC police, Peter Newsham, the police chief, it was the same thing he did on January 20th. Remember on Trump's inauguration? He let the so-called riot play for 20 minutes. None of the people who broke windows or who torched that limousine, none of them were arrested. The cops just let them go, but they had all the video. Then they kettled everybody else, and they charged them with a felony riot, people were facing 10 to 70 years in prison, and that took 2 years to win that case. We thought the same thing was going to happen Monday, and it almost happened. But what stopped it was Trump overplayed his hand with that photo op, and that turned the tide. So masses of people who are on our side took it as an opportunity to come back into the streets. So the effort to create this martial law has actually stalled out.
Well, Brian, thank you very, very much for joining us. We know you have to go. So we will
Thanks,
now
everybody. Nice seeing you.
We're going to turn now to Margaret Kimberly.
Hi, how are you all?
Okay, Margaret, thanks for joining us. Margaret, of course, is an editor and columnist at the Black Agenda Report, and we're really happy that she's joining us to give her perspective. And I want to specifically ask you now about the role of violence in social protest. Martin Luther King's quote about a riot being the language of the unheard is making the rounds again online. And the blaming of the outside agitators has come again from the 60s in the Deep South, and sounds like something Middle East dictators said in 2011 in the so-called Arab Spring. So
Yes.
Authoritarians are fond of saying that they're enemies. The only language they understand is that of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Can that be turned around to say that the only language that oppressive leaders understand is violence?
It is true. And I wanted to follow up on something that Brian said. He said Trump is in trouble. They're all in trouble. The mayor of New York City is in trouble. The governor of New York is in trouble. De Blasio ran for office as the liberal, the tale of two cities, blah, blah, blah. But now he backs the police. We saw 2 police vehicles plow into cars. Fortunately, no one was killed, but he praised them and then backtracked. Then Cuomo, and it's complicated in New York because the governor and mayor hate each other. And then Cuomo criticized the police. Then the police got mad. Then he backtracked. all of this shows they're all in trouble. There has been a complete loss of legitimacy by all of these people, and the system did it to itself, so that when there is a crisis like this, and the precipitating event, of course, was the killing of George Floyd, which was preceded by, we saw another killing. It wasn't cops, it was vigilantes, Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. We saw him die. We saw Floyd die. There are other things going on. We have more than 30 million people newly unemployed in the last few months with nowhere to turn, with the political party that lives off its old reputation and claims to be the party of working people doing absolutely nothing for them. Another primary rigged where Sanders, who capitulated sadly, where those people who wanted to see some of the things he was talking about being told, you're not getting it. And not only are you not getting it, we are giving you the most right-wing Democrat who was running, one of the worst people for a variety of reasons. So here we are now in a situation, and I want to say something about the word violence. I think of that as being a crime against human being. Property crimes to me are not, I don't think of those as violence. But I also think it has been, well, I'll put it to you this way. I don't think it was coincidence that the killer cop in Minneapolis was arrested the night after a precinct was burned. I believe that heightened their anxiety. They knew that the old method of, first they said, well, we fired him, and that was supposed to calm everybody down, but it didn't calm everybody down. And then when they arrested the one cop, that didn't calm everybody down. So now then they arrested all of them and charged all of them and increased the charges against them. That has not dissipated the actions in the streets. And most of the violence has come from the cops. Here in New York, it is the police that have attacked people. They have assaulted, for some reason, they take people's bicycles. I don't know why they're focusing on bicycles. Hopefully someone can explain that to me. They beat people up, they snatch their bikes. The curfew, this is our third night of curfew in New York. 2 nights ago, there were thousands of people on the Manhattan Bridge connecting downtown Brooklyn to lower Manhattan. And the police blocked both ends of the bridge in an effort to intimidate people, but none of it is working. People are angry. They are angry about these police murders. They're angry about their own situations. They're angry that the duopoly in this country keeps telling people, no, you can't have what you want. Especially people, what passes for a left in this country are constantly told, you can't ask for anything. If you don't vote for Joe Biden, who's a train wreck for a variety of reasons, then it's your fault that Trump wins. And we get Joe Biden going to a black church, talking about the police shooting people in the leg, and then he takes a knee, and that's what we're told is our salvation. So I think this has some staying power. Whether people throw bricks or not, and by the way, the agent provocateurs have been cops. And here in New York, we're told that these bricks were found all over town, and that proves outside agitators. And nothing is more disgusting to me than to hear Black elected officials sound like George Wallace. They should all be ashamed. I think the provocations are coming from the police. It's obvious the violence against journalists, against kids, against women is coming from them. This is a moment of deep crisis for the entire establishment, and they are all in trouble, and they don't know what to do.
Excellent, Margaret. Let's bring Garland in. You've been sitting there patiently, Garland. About 3 months ago, at the very beginning of the pandemic, you put out a video that I happened to watch, which said that you can anticipate people breaking into food shops to feed themselves, and that they weren't going to just sit around and take this. And in fact, a lot of the looting, if you can call it that, was of supermarkets, at least in that first couple of nights in Minneapolis. So Garland, tell us what you're seeing right now and why you were right about that.
Well, what I saw at the beginning, and I wish I could say it was empirical data or, some kind of a equation, but it was intuitive. I looked at the, the circumstance, and I realized they're telling people, and I recall beforehand, 60% of Americans had less than $500 for an emergency. Within 1 week after the pandemic, after the lockdown, the Congress came together to act on behalf of the richest people in the world and ensure that they weren't hurting, that they weren't required to have any savings whatsoever. They were taken care of. The other American people got much of nothing. And I recognize the terms that I used. I said people are out of work. Before you know it, at some point they'll be out of work, out of food, and out of time. When I look at this, you know, you can certainly, as has been spoken here, I think that the George Floyd injustice was a spark, and that we had a tinderbox. The dynamics were ready for this. So when I look at this crowd, you know, we hear a lot of discussion of race. I see a generation, you know, a crowd, a generation. I see people say a large portion of them under 35, under 30, in their 20s. I see a generation who is furious. And when we look on the street, we see anger. And let's not forget, you know, I was a law enforcement officer for many years. I retired as a law enforcement. So I guess to some perspective, I can see things through the eyes of a law enforcement officer. I was a working class person. So I keep thinking to myself also, you know what? Somewhere off the coast of the Canary Islands, there's a 500-foot yacht and there's somebody watching working class police officers and, you know, working poor people that at one time may have been working class, but now they're the poor and the working poor, beat the living daylights out of each other, tear up their own neighborhoods and wipe each other out. And what they figured out is this. Their money is all in the stock market. The stock market isn't real. It's totally unrelated to the bricks and mortar stores. It's simply a shell game that they play. So all they had to do was ensure that the government put enough money into the stock market to ensure that their investment stayed the same. And it doesn't matter what happens on the ground. So they're sitting on their yachts, they're watching the people, you know, the Americans beat themselves to death, and they're like, well, we haven't got our space station and our moon base quite ready yet for the next pandemic, so we can go there. But by the time they finish beating each other senseless, we should be able to make a move for a while and maybe watch this thing a little further. I'm being facetious in a way, but in a way, maybe not. So what I saw was, to me, a simple dynamic. You know, I said things like this. People are not going to sit in the house and watch their children hungry. We see these long lines. So I think a lot of this is about desperation. And I also say this is the first wave. If I was right, I don't know if I was right, maybe I was lucky. We won't even call that good luck, bad luck, but maybe it was possible that it was a coincidence that I predicted this and it happened. But if in fact I was anywhere near the truth, I would have to add this. The second wave has to be July and August. Because right now there are reopening going on, and people are thinking, okay, you know, I'm optimistic. They're reopening. I'll go back to that job I had as a bartender. If you're a millennial, as a waitress, the many things that they could do to make $1. Or some of them actually had jobs, you know, that gave them health care. That's the other thing. 42 million people lost their jobs and their health care. They can't afford to get sick. They can't afford to get injured. But that being the case, there will be some expectation, A, that they'll come back to a job, B, that the job they come back to will be there and will allow them to make enough money to, you know, feed their family, pay their bills, etc. Well, neither of those will be true for many, many of them. And then they will have some kind of an expectation that the government will step in and make them economically whole.
Garland, let me interrupt you to ask you about, because you were a police officer.
Yeah.
Tell us something about the mentality of the cops and the behavior we've been seeing. To me, they know this is an anti-police protest. At least it began that way. They take it personally, don't they? I mean, I have seen we've all seen these unbelievable scenes of pepper spraying and tear gassing people up against the wall and pushing people to the ground and all the other violence. What is the mentality of the average police officer right now in the middle of this? Does he see this as a personal attack on him and a chance for him to get back at society?
Well, I'd say something differently. And this is a sad state of affairs. And that is, it's not that these police officers are suddenly doing something different. To a lot of these police officers, this is routine. To a lot of police officers, if they come onto the scene, they arrest anyone they want to, they beat up anyone they want to. What we're seeing now is for poor people, for poor Black people in a poor Black community, this is a normal day of policing for them. Now we look at it and we see them push down, you know, a white millennial that's a small girl or someone who we're not accustomed to seeing get abused, or we've seen them grab a couple college students and drag them out of the car and we're outraged. But, I've done a lot of work in Baltimore. I worked for the ACLU specifically worked for the ACLU in Baltimore during the Department of Justice investigation. And what we found was what we see as outrageous was normal practice. I think Baltimore had arrested, when we checked one of our suits at the ACLU, they had upwards of 60,000 people that they would arrest. They would just say, shut up and do what I tell you or I'll arrest you. And if the person said anything, they'd bang them up with sticks for a bit, they'd drag them in. The person hadn't committed any crime. They would hold them overnight and simply release them. But the person would get beaten and taken in that night. And oftentimes not arrested, they'd just get a beating. So
Just for
it's
talking
outrageous,
back. Just for
but
talking
it's not
back
all
to
that
it.
abnormal for a lot of people.
Yeah, let me ask Richard, and I want to bring Elizabeth in because she has a bunch of questions. Richard, you've been listening to this. Any comments, particularly on what Margaret said about the establishment really has up against the wall here? Are they scared in your view? They know what to do?
Yes, I think they're scared. They're not that much scared, in my judgment, yet about the protests. They have the confidence of history that some combination of Democratic Party symbolism, the way Margaret said, coupled with Republican Party harshness, will do the job. I think they're wrong about it, but I think that's what they see. But here is what scares them. The economic crash, together with the pandemic, has produced a collapse on a scale they had no idea. It's not just that they didn't prepare for the pandemic, which they clearly messed up. And it's not just that they can't manage it. I mean, let's be honest. There's less than 5% of Americans have been tested as I speak to you. So we don't even know who has the disease. It's utterly unsafe to go back to work because you'll be standing next to people who have the disease but haven't been tested. This is an out-of-control disaster. That by itself wouldn't have overwhelmed them. But now they see, and by the way, just a footnote, we are now in the worst depression of U.S. capitalism. We have gone beyond the 25% unemployment. If you have 42 to 45 million unemployed, that's more than 25% of the U.S. labor force. The highest point of unemployment in the Great Depression was in 1933, and it was 25%. There is no precedent for this in the last century. And to have it happen at a time when the United States has taken this nationalist turn, cutting off its relationship with the rest of the world, and a pandemic it didn't prepare for and doesn't know how to control, that's too much. And when you add the irresponsible, out-of-control, narcissist idiot who we have in office, then it's clear that we don't have any mechanism to get under control. And that's, I think, what terrifies them. The protests then become kind of proof that this situation is indeed as terrible as they know it to be.
Elizabeth.
Thank you. Margaret, I had a question for you first, and that was that on social media, you've pointed out that one of the officers charged in the killing of George Floyd is Black. And I wanted to ask you what it was that you make of this, and what does this tell us about the reality of systemic racism in the police force?
Well, cops are going to cop in the vernacular. Two of the cops who killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore were Black. This cop in Minneapolis is apparently biracial, but he's clearly, as soon as I saw his photograph, I could tell that he was a person of African descent, and he is. But cops do what they do. One of the cops was Asian, but that's not surprising. We've had Asian cops, Latino. There was a Latino cop who killed Philando Castile in Minnesota, who arrested Sandra Bland in Texas, a Chinese cop who killed a man named Akai Gurley here in New York. So we see that being on the police force in particular grants a kind of whiteness, as it were. So the basis of racism in this country, I believe, is anti-Black racism. And so it's easy for people who aren't white but not Black either to be a part of this power structure, and they get a kind of honorary whiteness. The police, Garland was talking about cops in Baltimore, most of whom are Black, that engage in acts of brutality as well. So the police in this country, they function as a modern day slave patrol. So all of them can turn into slave patrollers, regardless of race. I also believe the police forces being what they are, officers are not likely to talk back, to say, in this case, for example, we see all three of them. Nobody said stop. Nobody said that's enough. Nobody said, okay, let's just arrest. Nobody did anything because that is the culture of the police force. So we will see people like this officer who also engage in brutality. So I'd say shocked, not shocked about when I made that discovery.
It's a great point about the relationship between slave patrols and the police force. For the listeners who aren't aware of that connection, do you want to expand on that as well?
Sure. In the days of chattel slavery, any white person could be part of a slave patrol. That slavery could not exist without a force of people, not just the slaveholders, but a civic force that helped to enforce the system. And that is, some argue, the basis of the Second Amendment, that these militias were, in fact, the slave patrols. And so any white person had the right to act as a police person against any Black person. And that's how the police operate today. So that regardless of income, education level, any Black person can at any moment find themselves in the clutches of the police.
Garland, I just wanted to ask you very quickly about your post via social media. And it's also something that you've mentioned just now, but basically connecting the 42 million unemployed, thanks to COVID especially, and the tidal wave of evictions following that, and the billionaire corporate bailouts, plus this police violence, resulting in this social unrest. Can you speak more about the connection between COVID-19 and the current wave of rebellions that we're seeing? And also, as you say, can you expand on the future that you see, whether this is going to just intensify, or do you think that it will in any way sort of die down as we go into the months ahead?
A perfect example is Germany. In Germany, unemployment went from 5% to 6% because in Europe, the governments have made the people whom they locked down economically whole. And so they didn't create such an era of desperation. James Baldwin said the worst thing, and I'm paraphrasing, that a society can create is a person who has nothing to lose. And that's what we created. In fact, we created a generation of people who have nothing to lose. We had people who looked at their future and did not see a future. They had an expectation that they would live better than their parents, and they realized they had a house payment and no house. So they had no future. And then within 8 weeks, they had no present. And at that point, we had an entire generation who has nothing to lose, and one need only watch one night of the protests, and you will recognize the age. There are some people of various ages, but mostly this is a young generation who is furious. We see anger and fury. As far as the future, in Los Angeles County alone, and this number, I just feel like I keep reading it wrong. Over 350,000 evictions are predicted by the end of the summer in Los Angeles County alone. Over 50% of the people in the county lost their jobs during the pandemic. In America, 40% of the people who make $40,000 or less lost their jobs in March. In July, their money runs out, their unemployment runs out, and many people didn't get the $1,200 or haven't gotten it yet, or because of the antiquated unemployment system, websites haven't gotten it yet. The level of desperation is bad, but come July or August, when they expect they'll be able to go back to work and make a living, and or the government will take action to ensure that they're not evicted, I predict a second wave. Now, there may be another spark, but when you have this kind of hot tinder, it doesn't take much of a spark. It won't take much. In fact, it could be something to do with another killing. It could be anything. But I predict when people are frightened and furious, and they've already kind of learned, they've already kind of gotten an experience of going into the street, of releasing their anger. I suspect that July, August, and going into the final run up to the election, that we're going to see a significant second wave of social unrest. And, I, like the other people here, it's not that I don't think that our government will or won't act in a manner that would address their issues. It's that I don't think the way that our government currently operates, that it's not what it produces.
What would legislation to address systemic racism look like to you? Would it be removal of qualified immunity for police? And, if so, would there be other aspects as well that need to be addressed? And secondarily to that, do you think that any real change can be implemented at a legislative level, or does it have to come from the ground up, or can some combination actually work in a real way?
Well, I think we ought to focus on the killing of George Floyd, but we have to talk about the qualified immunity. Here in New York, cops get to kill somebody and they don't have to talk for 48 hours. As an example, they are in bed with the prosecutors. They work hand in hand. But I think there are bigger problems. We've been talking about the COVID pandemic, and we have not talked about the impact it had on Black Americans. There are some cities where the only people who died were Black. Places like St. Louis, Milwaukee, almost every victim was Black. So there were a lot of people who died saying they couldn't breathe from this illness that the country was so ill prepared for. And obviously that means we're the ones who suffer first. So there's so much inequality. We see it play out because that's the role the police play in defending this system. But when you have a country where the minimum wage is meager and hasn't gone up for years, when there are fewer and fewer living wage jobs, the mass incarceration system, that starts with a police encounter, 2 million people in jail. The militarization of the police, this 1033 program, which gives surplus military equipment, every podunk in the country can have a police department, can have armored vehicles, which they're now talking about repealing, and that is positive. But we can't have a system, a country where 60% of the budget goes for defense spending, where the country gets to practice violence around the world and expect to have a just, peaceful country. So I'm happy that people are talking about these reforms of the police, but I hope the conversation gets bigger and we talk about the many inequalities that take people's lives in this country.
I've also seen you, Margaret, speak often about the attacks on the media and journalists that we've seen during this revolt. Can you discuss that? Do you think that it is in any way tied to the situation with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange? And just any of your comments in general on that?
Well, we have a general disregard for the press as journalism declines, as newspapers fold, as jobs disappear, as the presence of journalists disappear. They are people who are without respect and importance, plus the fact that the police are many of them are just goons. That's all they are. So they don't care if someone has a press pass. And we've all seen footage of people saying, I'm press, I got a pass, a CNN guy who was arrested on camera. Other people who've been beaten up, they don't care. And now they're mad. And here in New York, all their vacations have been postponed. Everybody's expected to work for the next week. And so I'm sure working with this militaristic, semi-fascistic organization in the first place, which abuses people in so many ways, now they're just mad. So they don't have respect for anyone. So their anger is now more diffuse. Black people are not going to be their only victims. Everybody potentially can be their victim. And that's not going to change either. And we see these mayors and governors curry favor with these police departments. It's constant.
The last thing I wanted to ask you before I turn things back over to Joe was just for your comment on the report that obviously while serving as Minnesota's chief prosecutor between 1999 and 2007, Amy Klobuchar declined to bring charges against more than 24 officers who had killed citizens while on duty, including against the cop that killed George Floyd. That's from Mint Press News. What does that say about the Democratic Party that Klobuchar is on the short list of vice presidential picks for the Biden campaign? I know you've spoken a lot about Joe Biden, and I'd like your thoughts on the whole Klobuchar situation.
Well, it tells you how I hope this year that the Democratic Party finally dies. I really do. This woman should be unacceptable. But we have a party that does not care what its people want, which disregards their feelings all the time. So this woman, who is a player who played a role indirectly perhaps, but who played a role in the story of George Floyd's death, is still being considered. So what do? They leaked the story to her that the other 3 cops are going to be charged as well. So she gets to leak the story before the Attorney General, Ellison, gets to make the announcement. I mean, it's very clear corruption. And it's allowed to go on also because our Black elected officials, the Black political class, as we call them at Black Agenda Report, the Blackness leadership class, work hand in hand with these people. They're joined at the hip. They owe their positions, their prominence, their money to being a part of the Democratic Party establishment. And that's why we have a presumptive Democratic nominee who in a Black church can talk about shooting people in the leg instead of in the heart.
Can you sum up, Richard, what this moment means in American history? I mean, it's not hyperbole to say this is an historic moment in so many ways. I mean, you have not inspired a lot of confidence in us in terms of how our leaders will deal with this. And that it could only be some more chaos and disintegration rather than a real movement towards progress. That's what I'm afraid of.
I see the behavior of the police as a symptom that this problem is far too profound, far too socially encompassing for the police to be able to do anything. They are being asked to do something that is absurd. It's not in their power. They can't do it. It's not a question of this or that protest. They can't keep the lid on a system that's blowing up. Let me give you a couple of examples. During the months of April and May, over 1/2 of all commercial enterprises did not pay their rent. Let me explain that to you again. Over 1/2 of commercial enterprises, including small businesses like Starbucks or Bed Bath & Beyond or dozens of others, did not pay their rent. What that means is that the commercial landlord to whom they normally would pay that rent isn't getting any revenue. And that means that that commercial landlord cannot pay back the banks from whom the money was borrowed to build the mall, to set up the whole enterprise, which then rented space to Starbucks and all the rest. This is a cascading catastrophe, what we're involved in, with a government that doesn't even understand what is going on, so it can't handle it. Here's a second statistic. Half of the daycare arrangements made by the half of the American people who can even afford a little bit of daycare, most of that's gone, and it isn't about to come back. And what that does is it adds to the already unsustainable pressure in the households that have children. What in the world are they going to do? There's no solution. There's no solution on the horizon. There is this vague nonsense about reopening America. Let me conclude with that. We are saying to the American people an absolutely astonishing thing. We're saying to the working class, we are going to make you go back to work. Remember when Trump ordered the workers in the meat packing plant in the Midwest? He ordered them to go back to work, right? The interesting thing wasn't that he made that order, which he doesn't have the legal right to do. That's not interesting. What's interesting was there was absolutely no accompanying demand that the employer make the workplace safe. Employers don't like to spend money on making places safe. That's why we have OSHA. That's why we have 800 laws over 200 years trying to force the employer to do what they do not want to do because there's no profit in it. They want the workers to work in crappy environments that they haven't spent money for clean air, clean water, clean bathroom. You know the story. You know it from another example. 100 years ago, children were made to work. Kids as young as 5 years old were regularly hired until the mass of people said, you can't do that to our children anymore. And the business community said, well, we have to. The whole economy will collapse if we don't. Our profits depend on it. Plus, we're doing a good thing for poor families because now they can get a little income from their kid, which they otherwise couldn't do. Spectacular. The American people said to them, you can go F yourself. There will be no child labor. They passed the laws that were necessary, and businesses had to find their profits somewhere else. I'm hopeful that the American working class will understand they are being herded like animals into workplaces that are unsafe. We haven't done the testing to determine whether the people there do or do not have a virus, which could kill you and which you could take home to infect everybody else in your household. The government is not only pressing them to go back to work. Trump has already threatened that if you're offered the job and you don't go back to work, you may be no longer qualified for the unemployment compensation because you have rejected a job. In other words, you either go back to an unsafe workplace or we're going to plunge you into poverty. By the way, in the Congress right now, a bill is being considered to provide a bribe to find workers that are so desperate that if you give them a bonus, they will go back to work. They will only get the bonus if they go back to work in a job where no requirement of safety has yet been enforced. I don't think these are sustainable arrangements. If you think we've built up anger up until this point, try to go with me to the level of anger that you're going to see when the failures to handle the pandemic and the failures to manage this economic crash are compounded by making people go back to work and get sick. This is, in a way that Margaret said before, this is another kind of slavery. People in other countries who did this would be called slave labor. You're forcing your workers back to work in an unsafe environment against their will. That's what slave labor always was. And I think what you're seeing is the slow recognition of white as well as non-white workers that that's the condition they are now being herded into.
Margaret, let's give you the last word.
Yes, just a quick last word. You know, these demonstrations, these actions have been spontaneous, but there needs to be grassroots organizing. It could be rather dangerous, frankly. You can't just live on this euphoria and this energy people have to express their outrage over so many things. There needs, and by taking to the streets, people are showing that they want to know what to do next. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. There's going to be a reaction against the protests. So we don't know where this can go either way. I'm hoping for positive results, but in the absence of, it's been decades now since we had viable grassroots movements. That's what I'm hoping to see. I think that will help the situation greatly. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Margaret, for joining us from New York City. And thank you to Richard Wolff, professor in Massachusetts Emeritus, joining us, I presume, from also in Massachusetts, Elizabeth Voss down in Arkansas. And we earlier spoke with Garland Nixon in Washington and Brian Becker in Washington. And this is Joe Lauria for CN Live. And it's a depressing note to leave you on. But let's regroup and come back again and see what is happening in the next couple of weeks. Until then, this is Joe Lauria for CN Live. Goodbye.
Good night, everyone.
Get out your notebook.